All right, well, we're at time, so I'm going to kick us off. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. If you're still getting situated, that's okay. We were discussing early on that this is also a pro-food, pro-beverage, pro-child, pro-pet, pro-everything conversation today, so no need to stress if you want to step away for a bathroom break or have a beverage or whatever. We welcome that. So before we really kick off, I wanted to do something called a land acknowledgement. This might be new to many of you. I'm just going to read a brief description that Kalamazoo College here uses locally. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of the land and the enduring relationship, both historical and current, that exists between Indigenous peoples and their territories. These statements are often done in public gatherings. So I'm just going to read a short one. And the main reason for this is because I kind of see there's a head and a heart to the film, with the head being kind of talking about the soil sciences and the permafrost, and the heart being the peoples of Shishmaref and the Inupiat people that mostly live there. So just to read a brief one, for here in Kalamazoo, we gather on the land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes region are also called the Anishinaabe, or original people, and their language is Anishinaabe-Moan. We acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between the people of the Three Fires and this land. So thank you for doing that. You might encounter that more and more as we go forward in the future. So for starters, just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Ian Magnuson. I am a board member, an executive board member for the West and Mid-Michigan chapter of the Fulbright Association. And I'm also the program and communications associate at Global Ties Kalamazoo. For Kalamazoo residents, we were until August also called Colleagues International. We're going through a big rebrand, and that's very exciting. And both of those organizations are sponsoring tonight's event. Just a couple little facts about me. I'm also on the City of Kalamazoo Environmental Concerns Committee. We had our meeting today talking about sustainability is a big topic and air quality and that kind of thing. So my brain has been fully environmental today. So I'm very excited to be with you today. And I think appropriately, I just want to mention the reason I'm interested in climate change stuff is because when I did my Fulbright trip to Germany, I taught English in Leipzig for a year in 2015 to 2016, right at the same time the movie was being produced, which is kind of cool. And while I was there, Germany, as many of you could guess, is a very cloudy country, and Michigan's a very cloudy state. And I often wondered, well, how can they do it there and we can't do it here? And it really comes down to political will, essentially. So that's kind of how I came into it. And before we introduce the organizations and then get started with the session, I actually wanted to do a poll and see where everybody who's joining us is coming at today. So we're gonna have a couple minutes. I'm just gonna pop the poll question up there and I'll close it at 7:10. So if you wanna take a quick gander at that, I just wanna see where everybody is today. And that includes participants and our speakers. If you wanna participate, I'd love to see that as well. Thank you. So I was thinking when I was producing this that many of you probably self-selected yourself into a discussion on climate change. So I'm really curious about how question 2 is going to settle out. I hope we don't get any low priorities, but maybe. All right. Oh, we're almost to everybody answered. So I'll just, once that hits, I'll end the poll. All right, I'll give it about 10 seconds. All right. So I think you should be able to see the polling results. I just thought it was kind of interesting. So as expected, most people that are joining us today are coming via invitation from the Fulbright Association, good chunk from Global Ties Kalamazoo, a few local organizations, and some other way, which I presume is potentially my parents, hello, and my girlfriend that I live with who's in another room, hello. So thank you for joining me today. I'm glad to see most people see climate change as both the middle or top priority. That's really cool for the discussion, but as I mentioned, that's maybe expected. And I'm also happy to see, I'm biased on this poll, but that's okay. I'm biased that I'm glad to see, in a sense, that we are impacted because, as we'll discuss later today, personal impact seems to be what drives people towards action. So thank you for participating. We're going to have a closing one too, just kind of a way to keep everybody engaged. So first, I'm going to turn it over briefly to Jody Michaels, the Executive Director of Global Ties Kalamazoo, to just talk about who they/we are. So Jody, please.
Thanks, Ian. And I'm so delighted to see everyone who is here with us today. And as an organization, so I'm Jody Michaels. I serve as Executive Director of Global Ties Kalamazoo. And there are a few things that are exciting for me about today. One is that, you know, from my understanding, this is really part of the big kickoff for the West and Mid-Michigan Fulbright Alumni Association. And as a person who's spent their entire career in the international sphere, local community, international community, where they intersect, every time there's a new internationally focused local community organization, it's a yay, because, you know, a big important piece of, I mean, this film speaks to this so much, but local is global, global is local. And, you know, whatever we are working on, small is all, the tiny things in our local community have big ripple effects in the world. And so I'm just, I'm delighted that we as an organization are able to be part of this event today. I'll just share just in brief for those who are not in West Michigan or who are unfamiliar, but Ian mentioned this earlier, Global Ties Kalamazoo, for the past 25 years of its 50-year history, which we're celebrating 50 years this year, was called Colleagues International. And so Global Ties Kalamazoo is our new name, and our new tagline is exchange is for everybody. And so for everyone who's come here through the Fulbright prism, for most people, when we think about exchange, we think about students, we think about academics, we think about people in that higher ed sphere. And the work that we do really is everybody else. So we do youth leadership programs, and more than anything, we do adult professionals, adult emerging leaders from countries all around the world who have diplomatic relations with the United States. And the biggest program that we do is the International Visitor Leadership Program. So we bring people from all around the world to engage with Kalamazoo, and have been doing this, of course, virtually in spaces like this for the past many more than a year months. And so I would just invite everyone, in whatever it is that you do in your day-to-day life, be an engaged citizen diplomat. And when we say citizen, we mean citizen of the world. You know, engage with people across difference, across borders, across cultures. And when we learn from one another, we start to understand each other. And the film speaks so much to that. I'm not going to take any more time on, you know, what we do, but you're welcome to visit. We'll put in the chat. You can go to globaltieskzu.org, get a sense of what it is that we do in our community. And when we say Kalamazoo, we actually mean West Michigan. So we're up in Traverse City, Grand Rapids, over in Battle Creek, this side of the state. And yeah, we're just thrilled to be part of this, and welcome anyone who wants to get involved to dive in with us. And thank you everybody who's going to share very important stuff with us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jody, for that overview. So I'm actually going to do a quick overview of what the Fulbright Association is, and then we're going to get into it. So just really quickly, for those who don't know, similar to IVLP, International Visitor Leadership Program, Jody mentioned, the Fulbright program is 75 years old. I believe IVLP is 80. So Fulbright's the second oldest international exchange program, founded in 1946. And it sends both Americans abroad to do advanced research and English teaching, which is what I did. And it also brings foreign nationals here to complete degrees. And I actually got involved by working with a gentleman from Myanmar. And so that's kind of my entry point, and it's been a great experience ever since. So the Fulbright Association is for alumni of that program and friends of that program. And broadly, similar to what Jody mentioned, our purpose is to promote mutual understanding amongst peoples around the world. I believe that's a lofty goal, but I think it's also grounded in the work we do when it's both the actual Fulbright program of doing exchange and doing events like this. So I think hopefully we're bringing the world together, even just in the United States, a little bit closer together. One quick housekeeping note to people in our catchment area, which is actually almost identical to Global Ties Kalamazoo. Sorry to our out-of-state people that might not get what I'm about to do here, but we're basically this line of the state to the west. So our out-of-state guests, Michiganders, use our hand because the lower peninsula looks like a mitten as a map all the time. So we are accepting members for those of you who might not be anymore and would like to get involved again. We're a new chapter, the West and Mid-Michigan chapter. And we're also looking for a few more executive board members, including a treasurer. So if you're interested, please contact Michelle Metro Rowland. She's, I believe, on this call, but she's driving, and I can send a follow-up email with more information. And one final note, I just wanted to say before we get started, you are free to have your camera on or your camera off. I personally, as someone who spends a lot of hours on Zoom, prefer talking to faces, but by no means are you required. If it's the evening and you want to have your sweatpants on and be comfortable, that's great too. So the fun part, I'd like to introduce our guests today, and then we're going to start with a moderated question and answer period where I have prepared hopefully more questions than we have time to get through, and then we're going to move into questions from you all as the audience, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we approach that. So what I'm going to ask is each of our guests to introduce themselves. I'm going to call your name. If you want to just unmute, say who you are, what you do, and maybe how you became involved in the film. And actually, it was kind of interesting just in our pre-meeting. I get the feeling most of you haven't talked directly face-to-face since production. So I love being a part of a little reunion. So for starters, I'd like to introduce David C. Weindorf, a fellow executive committee board member. David, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is David Weindorf. I serve as Vice President for Research and Innovation at Central Michigan University. And I became involved with the film early on. This is something that Paul Hunton and I discussed. It really grew out of the Arctic Soils Field Tour, which I participated in for more than a decade with Dr. Ching Liu. And as he was nearing retirement, that really became the impetus to start to archive his work, and spoke with Paul about this, and we developed the concept of the film. And then, reached out to Laureen and Mark and others, John and Nick, to really become key parts of this. And you see them extensively through the film. And as you mentioned, we went on this big film tour as we made the release, and we're in all these different film festivals and whatnot. So we spent a lot of time together, both doing the filming and then, touring the film around. But it's been, several years since I've seen many of them. So it's really great to have everybody on the call tonight, and so nice to be with everyone once again.
Excellent. Thank you, David. I'm going in no particular order, just faces on the screen. Paul, if you'd like to introduce yourself next, please.
Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Paul Allen Hunton. I am the General Manager and Director at Texas Tech Public Media here in Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech University, and I'm the director and producer on the film. David kind of gave how it all started. He was here at Texas Tech and had a great idea for a film looking at Dr. Ching Liu's soil tour in Alaska. And he came to us at Public Media here in Lubbock, and he said, I think we have an opportunity here to tell a story that's not only the story of the legacy of this tour and this work, but also what this tour and this work has really found out about climate change through the study of soils, through the people of Alaska, through the changing environment in Alaska, and how it's affecting all the different aspects of life in Alaska. And he said, I think it's primed to make a documentary. And he and I worked he had already secured some funding. He worked with us to secure some more funding through Texas Tech University and Public Media. And then we set out on our grand adventure. I'd never set foot in Alaska. And the next thing you know, we're in the Arctic Circle, filming this very important documentary. And I was saying beforehand, as we were kind of talking before everyone arrived, about how this film has become more relevant each day, each minute that it's been out in existence. And we knew that when we filmed it, but it's just a stark reminder of the challenges that we face as not only a country, but a race of humans who have to stare this down and figure out a path forward. And so I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Laureen, if you'd like to go next, please.
Hey, hi, my name is Laureen Lynn. I'm based in Palmer, Alaska, the owner of Red Mountain Consulting. I'm a soil scientist with a specialty in permafrost and a restoration ecologist. And when I was doing my master's studies, I worked with Ching Liu was my lead professor. Of course, did the soils tour and met David Weindorf through that experience, and was linked to the film through that connection. And right now I work on a lot of large restoration projects in Alaska, all around the state, mostly in the Arctic and the South Central areas, but not sure what else to say, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Excellent. Thanks, Laureen. We'll have lots more to say as we go along for sure. John, if you'd like to go next, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. John Galbraith. I'm a professor of soil and wetland sciences at Virginia Tech. And I took the Arctic Soils tour with Ching Liu and Gary Michelson. And I went on that 2 different times. And then David Weindorf and I are longtime acquaintances from Texas Tech University. And David discussed the concept of filming Ching Liu's last trip. And so that was my 3rd trip. And so he invited me to be part of that. And I'm very grateful for that. And very happy to be part of this presentation tonight and discussion about the film.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Mark, if you'd like to go next, please.
My name is Mark Clark. I am retired NRCS Pacific Northwest Regional Director of Soil Survey, and I have been active in Alaska Soil Survey program for the last 40 years. And my interest started back in 1989 when the Governor Cooper, the Cooper administration in Alaska, asked a group of scientists to participate in a climate change group to investigate things that were going on. We were starting to see changes on the Bering Sea with the ice pack coming in later and going out earlier, and large storms that were affecting villages. And so at that time, we started to ask the question, what's going on? And so I've been involved with climate change since 1989 in Alaska. And I've been involved with Ching Liu. I was actually his first graduate student, and we worked on a number of projects over the years. So I was fortunate to be able to participate in the North Slope field trip and also in the documentary. So my interest continues. I like to make observations. Since I'm retired now, I travel a lot, and I've had the opportunity to see changes going on. In the last 2 weeks, I came down from Alaska and seen a significant number of changes, from the drying of the Northwest prairie potholes to massive recession of the Slims Glacier in the Yukon, and stream piracy associated with the climate change. Extremely record lower river levels in the upper Yellowstone River last week. They hit 800 cubic feet per second, which is the lowest the Yellowstone has been in this time of the year. And coming down here to New Mexico, the second wave of pinyon pine loss, which is associated with the drought that's going on down here right now. So I'm very interested, and I continue to be involved in my retirement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for that added context and really grounding us in the science and the immediacy of the issue that we're here to talk about tonight. Nick, would you like to round us out, please?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm glad you picked me last because I think that's my rightful place in this group of very experienced and amazing folks that I'm joining tonight. But my name is Nick Jelinski. I'm a soil scientist and faculty member in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. And my introduction to permafrost affected soils was working for the National Park Service in the context of change. So I worked in Gates of the Arctic National Park as part of an inventory and monitoring program that involved soils and vegetation that was set up actually in the mid to late 2000s to monitor change over a period of decades. And so if you haven't been able to tell already from all of the speakers, all roads in permafrost affected soils in Alaska lead to Dr. Ching Liu that I think we've all been influenced by in one way or another. And even in retirement, he remains fairly active. And so, so I happened to be on his last field tour, and I knew that that was an opportunity I didn't want to miss. And fortunately, that was the time that David and Paul were doing this project. And so thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Nick. So I was planning on asking about it a little bit later, but since you all individually brought it up, I want to lead off with a quick discussion of Dr. Ching Liu's work. So I'm wondering if maybe Mark might be able to lead us off as his first graduate student to briefly describe what is the Arctic Soils Field Tour and what was he looking to achieve over the many years of his work? And then once Mark's concluded, anybody else that wants to chime in, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Ian. Ching Liu, the field trip was a great opportunity to showcase what's happened with permafrost in Alaska and the realm of soil science in the northern environment. And to take that back further, back in the 90s, the GELISOL, or the Soils with Permafrost Order, was set up, and Ching Liu was really one of the main players in getting the new soils order set up. And as a part of that responsibility, Ching Liu felt he needed to teach people what permafrost was all about, how we describe it, the unique characteristics of the soil. So the natural thing for him to do was to set up the field trip, and the field trip has had a different focus over the years, but basically it's to expose people, both soil scientists and other interested scientists, in permafrost in the northern environment and how it differs from the boreal forest, the subarctic, to the Arctic, the North Slope, and also to show how fragile it is, and to show how much carbon is tied up in this environment, and just to give people an appreciation for this northern environment, and the fact that no, it's not snow and ice all year round. It has a very significant period, and that period produces some very significant soils and wetlands. So Ching Liu, this was his way of being able to provide a forum to show what GELISOLs and permafrost was all about.
Ian, let me jump in and just follow up on that just a little bit. And I'll tell you, I remember very distinctly when I was a young assistant professor, I came up to Ching Liu at a professional meeting at the Soil Science Society of America after he had presented. And I asked him, I said, Dr. Ping, I'm teaching a soil science class at my university. could I please use some of your photos, to illustrate these different concepts in my class? And he said, well, I'll be happy to send them to you, but better than that, why don't you come on my Arctic Soils field tour and you can get your own pictures? I was like, okay, this sounds great. So I went up there with a couple of students and we really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I got those photos that I needed and came back and taught that in my classroom. And then I started taking students up there every summer, right? 2 or 3 or 4 students. And he would always reserve a few slots for me. And he knew that I would invite some folks up. And the recurrent theme that I heard year after year from those students is after going on that trip, they would never look at the world the same way again. I can't tell you how many times I heard that from students. So it was a profound impact that had on the lives of everyone who went on that trip.
That's excellent to hear. And sorry, I had a quick note. Yes, thank you for sharing that. And I think it kind of is related to the overall exchange experience that kind of brought us here into this room. You know, you don't have to go to Europe like me or Asia or somewhere else. You can go to Alaska and have your worldview changed. And that's really incredible. I'm wondering, I had a kind of a weird question that I wanted to throw out, especially to those of you that are currently or recently in Alaska. I was wondering if, and maybe Laureen can lead off with this question. Can you describe what it's like being out in there in the permafrost and the subarctic areas doing your field work in ways that might not come across in the film? Like, can you describe the smells or some of the sounds that a microphone might not pick up that's looking to listen to somebody talk or something?
Sure, I think I can speak to that. Smell is a great place to start because so when we dig pits and permafrost, of course, some of it melts on the surface. And so we get to smell it. And permafrost, when it melts, has a very distinct smell. It's not entirely pleasant, although it's not entirely unpleasant. It's, I don't even know how to describe the smell, but it's somewhere between decomposing plant material and, I don't know, just what you might expect goopy melting dirt to smell like. So the smells are very distinct. Of course, when I'm doing a lot of my actual work in the Arctic, I am not digging soil pits. So the smell of the Arctic, of course, like every place, has its own distinct smells that come from mostly from the plants, which is just a very sweet, wonderful, wonderful smell there. Of course, it's really hard. There's not a lot of vocabulary to describe smells, but it's sweet and kind of almost piney from the ericaceous plants and the woody plants and the smells of grasses and such. I think one of the things that working with people in the Arctic who are not from the Arctic, I think I lose my perspective a little bit because I'm so Alaska centric and I'm not doing work elsewhere that I kind of lose my perspective on how other people see it. So it's good for me to hear what other people have to say. And one of the things that seems to strike people is that they expect when you go to the Arctic that you're going to be surrounded by wildlife. And so while sometimes a herd of caribou might come through and you see, tens, dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of caribou at a particular time, it's not the wildlife wonderland that you see in the movies about Alaska. Those places where they film a lot of the wildlife are kind of different places because there's not a lot of available food sources in the Arctic. So while there is plenty of wildlife there, you don't encounter it on a daily basis. And this last summer, I saw bears only once in the entire summer. So I think that's something that's a little surprising to people. I think part of it too is just that it's a wide open landscape since there's no trees. And so your viewscape is very, very long. And so you really can see how vast the area is and how much wild land there is, which is striking to a lot of people. And with that, I think is that the bears know that we're there before we know that they're there. And so that's one of the reasons we don't see them. So temperature wise, I was just getting a comment earlier about my bio that I have that says that I spend my year in a parka, even in the season most people call summer. Well, it has definitely changed. The last few summers, I have been working in a t-shirt with a bug shirt over it, of course, to protect me from the mosquitoes. But under my bug shirt, I'm wearing a t-shirt, which is really distinct and new up there, to be hot, not wearing long underwear every day, but to just be straight up hot working up there. I was surprised to see my car thermometer this summer hit 83 up way up north, and that is just so hot for up there. And then the other thing that I think that is really striking in the Arctic, of course, is the light. So in the summer, just because of the tilt of the Earth and the way that the globe turns, the sun just circulates around the sky and never sets for, I think it's 67 days or something like that, where it just goes around and around and around, and it never actually sets. And so in the summer, that's a hard adjustment for people. And then, of course, you get a fall and spring season where the sun is setting, and you get something that's similar to 12 and 12, where other people have night and day. And then in the winter, of course, it's there's above the Arctic Circle, there's 60 some days where the sun never actually rises. So the sun will come close to the horizon, so you get a dusky kind of light, and then it fades away again. So there's a few hours of dusky light in the day, but no actual sunrise. And then I think the other thing is just that it's huge. It's hard to explain how gigantic the Arctic is when you take it in as a whole. And, you know, Arctic and subarctic, and how much of the land is undeveloped. I think that's striking to people, especially when you fly across sections of the Arctic where there's nothing. There's one road that goes right up the center of the state to the Arctic. And otherwise, any of the villages that are up there are only accessible by airplane, essentially, or walking, if you were to be so inclined.
Yeah, thank you, Laureen. And actually, I will be coming back to that for Paul and David on shooting in such a remote environment. And I can very much, I think us in here in West Michigan can certainly relate to your alarm over the temperatures. Here in Kalamazoo, we've had 2 green Christmases in a row with it being 70 degrees outside. And, you know, Michigan is, you know, fairly south compared to Alaska, but, you know, we're used to being white Christmases at least 30 plus years ago. So before we move on a little bit into some more scientific questions, I was wondering kind of the inverse question, if I could get maybe David and Paul's and Nick's initial impressions when you showed up in Alaska. What was there anything that surprised you, or, you know, just echo any thoughts Laureen had? And feel free anybody to jump in for that one.
Oh, you go first, and then I'll add something.
Okay. Everything. I am a child of the desert. I grew up in New Mexico and lived in New Mexico for 28 years before I moved to West Texas, where there is not much difference in anything. Difference in elevation, difference in landscape, difference in wildlife, etc. It's all pretty much the same. And so whenever we set out to go to Alaska, we did tons of research, and I had basically a Bible we put together that included all of the information that David sent about Dr. Ching Liu's research, different books on permafrost, different books on soil science, so that there's nothing more intimidating as a documentary filmmaker. There's nothing more intimidating than interviewing some of the most brilliant minds in any field that you might be, navigating as a filmmaker, because you don't want to look like you don't know what you're talking about. And you also want the film to be good and to be informational and have the right types of questions. So did all that initial research, but didn't really do a ton of research on, like, as a filmmaker, what should you be thinking about as you go into Alaska with your equipment. And so we got up there, and everything went well, and it was all good. But there were a few times where, batteries, the power of those evaporate whenever the temperature, we got up into the Arctic in the spring, the first journey. So the production was a couple different trips up to Alaska, and the first journey was in the summer. And Alaska in the summer is one of the most beautiful places on earth. It's just the perfect temperature. and there's light all day. So as a filmmaker, what can you ask for than to have light almost 24 hours a day? We would shoot and then look at our watch and be like, it's midnight. And we're shooting, and we were up near Denali, and it was midnight, and it was still bright outside, or brightish, and it was like, okay, this is incredible. But it was like those types of things. That was the temperature, the nature, the idea that when they say the last frontier, it's the truth. Once you get north of Fairbanks, like in that area, it really is, there is a very much, not only it's a shock to really enter into that space, especially as a filmmaker. Luckily, we had such amazing guides in Dr. Ching Liu and everybody who was on the soil science tour, because as a filmmaker going up there, if I didn't have that sort of steady backbone, it would have been very difficult. The other thing I just want to mention is the people. The people of Alaska are incredibly resourceful, strong, energetic, passionate. There is a layer of like, I'm a very vibrant, outgoing, loud person. And because in Alaska, you're so in touch, or more in touch with your environment, with nature, with survival in certain parts of Alaska, that interaction between a loud Texan, Southwestern desert kid, and the people of Alaska, there was some of that, but like people like Mark, people like Lorene, really opened up their homes and really taught me so much. Lorene took me and my son, so we shot the film, and then I went back up there for the Anchorage Film Festival, and Lorene took my son and I sledding. And so the relationships that you build and the people of Alaska are really, it really is, I talk about it all the time. New Mexico is home. It's my favorite place in the world. And Alaska is second. It's just one of the most beautiful places in the world. And so part of this film is a reckoning with like, here's this place that I really admire and these people that I admire and love. And then to see and to hear about what's going on with climate change and the way it's adversely affecting all of that beauty, all of that lifestyle. It is a complicated relationship, and it is a complicated thing to have made this film. But I can't say enough about just how magical the experience of Alaska is.
So one thing that I'll add is this was my first engagement with making a film, and I kind of served as executive producer, which I learned on the fly. Part of that job is to, kind of set up all of the logistics, right? When are we going to meet people? Where are we going to meet people? Who can we interview? Those kinds of things, right? And Alaska is so remote and so vast, it's really hard to contact people. If we want to contact scientists at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, summertime is their time to go to the field, and they might leave the university and they're gone for 2 months, and they won't have access to a phone, an email, anything when they're out camping in the woods, collecting samples, doing those kinds of things. I mean, there are places that we went where we had a satellite phone where we would set up meetings and say, okay, we're going to meet you on this date at this mile marker along the Dalton Highway. And we just hoped the people showed up, right? I mean, that's the kind of wing and a prayer almost that we were going on. So it was really challenging, to kind of put together the schedule. And so it took a lot of planning on the front side, but again, working with Mark, with Lorene, with Ching Liu and the group, they had a lot of connections that they were able to connect us with, and that really worked out well. And that, they were also instrumental in getting us into Shishmaref, where we could talk with some of the local peoples, and that added an entirely cool, amazing dimension to the film where we could explain the impacts of climate change and how it's affecting Native peoples. And I think that was really a compelling aspect of the film.
One quick anecdote. David, talking about the logistics, he set up the hotels, just everything David handled that was outside of the scope of the soils tour. We registered, we did all the math. David did all the math for us, and like, what's the cheapest way? How do we do this on a low budget? This is a very low budget documentary. And the cheapest way to do it was to actually enroll in the class. So the entire film crew enrolled in the class so that we could film the class. That was the cheapest way to do it all and to make sure that our meals were taken care of, our hotels and all that kind of stuff. So we all have 3 hours of credit, and our students of Dr. Ching Liu, Mark Clark, Lorene, David, Nick, and John, as we did this. But on that second trip, when we went in the spring and we went to Shishmaref, David was chartering flights and all of those types of things that you have to do to get around Alaska. Like Laureen said, there's one highway that cuts up through the middle. If you want to go anywhere else, you're gonna have to talk to a pilot. You're gonna have to get someone to fly you there. And David set all of that up. But one of the things is he got an Airbnb or a Verbo when we left Shishmaref. And I think it was advertised as a yurt, but it was absolutely someone's tool shed. And so there was 4 of us sleeping head to toe, side by side in a tool shed with a dog chained to a post outside of it. It was incredible and amazing, and I wouldn't change anything about it. I can't talk enough about all the great memories that we made in Alaska. Mark Clark taught me how to shoot a bow and arrow, and just there was so much love in making this film that goes beyond just the scope of what we were able to do, but really speaks to the heart of the people of Alaska and the work that all of these amazing scientists have done in their careers, and this story that we set out to tell.
Those are great anecdotes. Thank you for sharing. And actually, before we end my portion, I will like to return to talk about the people of Alaska as well, particularly in Shishmaref. But I do want to take a hard right and depressing turn a little bit to the science. And so I was wondering if maybe John and then Mark brought up a few points in his intro. If John and Mark could maybe give us some updates on where the science of climate change is right now, maybe things we know now that we didn't know 5 or 10 years ago. And I really appreciate Mark's comment getting involved in 1989, as those who are involved in climate change work know 89, 90, 91 is a huge point in when kind of the world just like woke up and knew climate change is an issue, is when the UN started looking at it. So I'm really interested to hear Mark's points on being involved at such a pivotal time. But John, if you could lead us off a little bit on 2 things, just where the science is right now. And another thing that I found really fascinating about the soil work, and something I recall from in my graduate studies at MSU, I took a climate change class and they talked about the albedo effect with snow melt. And so one thing I was curious if maybe you could talk about is other feedback loops that are generally bad when it comes to climate change. But if there are any others in addition to the carbon release from the permafrost, from the albedo effect, anything else that you might be aware of?
All right, well, I'll begin with where the science is now. And it's interesting that even back when we filmed this film and just before that time, there was still quite a bit of, let's say, debate about what was causing these higher temperatures. Nobody was disputing that the Earth was getting warmer, but there was argument about why it was getting warmer. And the question was, what is causing this? I think right now the consensus in the last 3 or 4 years is a lot of even not just what I read in the literature, but also just by talking to people and friends that I'm acquainted with, there were a lot of doubters about climate change even existing 5 years ago. And those same people now never even blink if you mention global warming or global cooling in the case of the Antarctic, actually getting colder than before. So I think that that's a change in the perception of the public. As far as the scientist goes, the more recent research just basically has driven nails in the coffin as far as what the causing effect is. Now, the disturbing thing is whether, no matter what the cause, the question is, well, first the question was, is it real? Secondly, what's causing it? And third, what can we do about it? And right now, the problem is I don't think we have a solution of what we can do about it other than a complete change in our energy systems worldwide. And even that it may be too late. So what is happening, the climate has already changed in Alaska, and it's changing more rapidly than anywhere else on Earth. And it's to the orders of magnitude, to the point that the warming in Alaska over the last 10 years equals the amount of warming worldwide over the last 137 years. And that's alarming. And it is a feedback loop. And I know Mark will talk more about this, but it has changed the snowfall. It has changed the rainfall. It has changed the patterns of the fronts. It has changed the wind. It has changed so many things that are probably not going to change back. And all of those things have changed the soil. Now, you say to yourself, well, how do you change soil when soil's been forming for hundreds of thousands of years in most parts of the earth and millions of years in some parts of the earth? How do you change it? Well, the soil is different where you have permafrost and where you have deep freezing, and the amount of carbon that's trapped and has been protected from microbial decay is now unprotected. And the amount of methane that was trapped in bubbles inside permanently frozen parts of the soil are now being released. That methane is now being released into the atmosphere. And so that's just a couple of the changes that are going to cause other changes. And Mark, would you like to talk about those?
Yes, yeah. You know, that we're seeing, it's interesting with my tenure in Alaska, because the change is happening so rapidly that Nick has been working out in the Copper River Basin, and back when I came to Alaska, the Copper River Basin is in the zone of discontinuous permafrost. It's permafrost that's very warm. It's near the point of thawing. And in the time that I've been in Alaska, and I mapped that area back in the early 80s, Nick has been out there reinvestigating these areas, and the frost is basically gone. The permafrost is out of these areas out there. And I can cite many examples. Western Alaska is kind of the biggest harbinger of changes to come, because as that ice sets in the Bering Sea, the pack ice sets in the fall, Western Alaska goes from more of a maritime influenced climate to a severe interior climate. And because the ice is setting in later in the year, well, the climate there is staying warmer and warmer for 2 months in the shoulder seasons, and that dark water absorbs more higher long wave radiation, and it warms the adjacent landscape. So back in the 90s, we started to see soils that showed all the physical properties and chemical properties of a permafrost soil, but the permafrost and the associated water table that often causes this very soggy environment were gone. So we started to see hundreds of thousands of acres in the Aniak area in Western Alaska where this permafrost was beginning to disappear. And so we started to see this in the 90s, and it was pretty wide scale in Western Alaska. That's where it happened first. That's where the climate was changing, because the pack ice was coming in later and going out earlier. We started to see it out there and how it impacts. I think one of the biggest impacts it has on the villages in Western Alaska is the Yukon and the Kuskokwim were our travel corridors in the winter. And they're no longer safe for travel because they're freezing so late and they're breaking up so early that there is such a brief window where it's actually safe to travel on these rivers with vehicles and whatnot. That it's it's really affecting the transportation options for these communities in Western Alaska. We've got 25 villages that are starting to experience direct impacts of climate change there with thermal temperature erosion, thermal karsting that occurs along the rivers now that this permafrost is starting to leave. So this has been going on since the 90s. It's starting to accelerate in the recent years. We're starting to see land slope failures in South Central Alaska in areas where permafrost is really sensitive. It's within a degree or two of thawing. So we're starting to see large land failures along the river systems. We're starting to see slope failures at a broad scale. We're starting to see infrastructure damage. Right now, UAF estimates that in the next 20 years, we're gonna see $5 billion in infrastructure damage caused by melting permafrost associated with climate change. This is big. And when I drove out this year, there's stretches of the highway where there's only about 1,500 miles of high quality highway in Alaska. In the 80s, that highway would have to be redone on about a 15-year interval because, you know, they put black pavement down and it absorbs heat and it melts the underlying permafrost. Well, now it's happening so fast, we're seeing 5 years where these roads become no longer passable, have to be replaced. So the acceleration in the last 2 decades has been phenomenal. It really has. And we see it in disease in the forests here. We're seeing the spruce budworm in the spruce forests where we never had it 30 years ago because the winters are too cold and the larvae can't survive the winters. Now we're seeing spruce budworm expand up the river systems in Alaska. And the list goes on, and it's starting to happen fast. It's happening at a rate that's fast. And now it's starting to happen down in the lower 48. I mean, coming down here, it's happening down here now. So that even shows you, 10, 15 years ago, it was hard to explain to someone that the climate was changing because there weren't examples that they could see, things that were obvious to them. And now we're seeing it. We're seeing it low runoff rates. We're seeing reservoirs that are lower than they've ever been before. We've seen diseases and drought conditions that 20 or 30 years ago. We're seeing fires. We're seeing over 2 to 3 times the levels of fires in the West than we saw 30 years ago. So now it's becoming so obvious and it's becoming so accelerated. And the science now, we collected enough science to support it. Soil moisture is 1/10 of what it was in a lot of these forested communities 30 years ago. So the fires are going to be big. They're going to be more devastating. We're seeing less snow and more rain in the mountains and the Rockies. So, runoff comes earlier, and that fall season where we rely on that runoff from that late high mountain snow is becoming less and less. And that's devastating in the fall when we need that runoff. So these are just a few examples of what's going on. And it's happening so fast now that it's phenomenal. It really is.
Yeah, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but it sounds like an example of history happens very slowly, then all at once. Kind of, maybe somebody's heard that before, but yeah, it's alarming to say the least. I'm actually about at the end of my question period time, but I did really want to ask a question about Shishmaref. So I really loved, in particular, there was a lady, I think her name was Ada Cleveland. She said, "I wish I could go live at a senator's house and he could live at mine for a while." And, I think that resonates a lot with pretty much anybody who's ever facilitated anything with politics. But I was curious then if maybe Nick, Paul, or David, if you could offer some of your experiences when you went to Shishmaref, how you got connected or selected the people that you did to be interviewed, and also just had a more specific question with Ada. But yeah, so just some initial impressions when you went to the city. Oh, and was anybody skeptical of you being here? Why are you here? Why are you filming this village? Why do you care, kind of thing? So yeah.
That's the first thing that we had to overcome. And I want to really give a shout out to Laureen because both her and Mark were instrumental in helping establish that level of trust. They've both been out there, worked in some of those communities, know some people in those communities. And so, you know, when we were able to say, we're friends of Laureen, we're friends of Mark, they realized this isn't just, you know, some film crew showing up from Texas, you know, that wants to sensationalize something. These people are genuine friends that we can trust. And just having the time to sit down with them and just listen, you know, listen to them tell stories about their lives, the challenges that they face from the lifestyle that they lead was really, really an educational experience for all of us. I would say, you know, 10 to 1, we spent time listening as opposed to asking questions, just having them lead us around and show us the lifestyle. And you see a lot of that in the film, right? The way that they live their lives. But again, you know, Laureen might want to comment with, or Mark, with some of the contacts that they've had. And Paul, I know you have some pretty profound thoughts too about working with those folks.
Yeah, so Ada actually lived in Kotzebue, which was where we went to after Shishmaref. Isn't that correct, David? Ada was in Kotzebue, but which is that region, that area. But in Shishmaref, you know, people were very, very, very willing to share their story because they get it. They see it. They see their island shrinking. They know that time is limited. They know that things are in a very, very bad place more than anyone else, I would say, probably in the world. Maybe not everywhere. I haven't talked to everyone everywhere who's being affected at this rate this quickly. But I would say Shishmaref is one of the most vastly affected places in the entire world who are seeing these things in real time. So in some ways, there was a cry of desperation of like, please tell our story. We want this to get out there and for people to know what we're seeing, because they are in a lot of ways down to, you know, in the film, some of the realities of, someone said earlier and talked about we don't have the political will necessary to make these changes happen. And that was some of the things that you see in the film, that the state of Alaska cannot afford to basically move the entire village off. So you lose a language, you lose a culture, you lose those connections that are so important to the Native people of Alaska, to Native people everywhere. And it's all due to climate change. And so one of the things that I really thought was so amazing was about how willing they were to tell their story because of how real climate change is to them and how it's affecting how they live in their future and everything else. But I will also say their spirit and the way that they carry themselves and the way they tell their story and the way they are passing down their heritage, their language, their culture, their skills, all of those types of things was really awesome. It wasn't just telling us about the ways that climate change was affecting them. It was telling them about the way they carve ivory, the way the ivory washes up on the shore and the way they carve that, and the way, you know, all of those types of storytelling and narratives popped up in the time that we were there. And so all of that, the full picture of Shishmaref was just how beautiful, you know, that community is and that culture is, how connected they are to the land and to the reality of what they're facing, but also just how open and willing they were to share all of that with us was really profound and really an incredible experience.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I do want to lift up, I did write down Andrew Ningea Look Sr. I believe he was the one that was interviewed about the carving. And I recall I looked him up. He's active on Instagram and stuff. So yeah, that's one small way you can continue to support the community up there. So thank you everybody for answering my questions. We are now moving
Ian,
on. Yes,
I
Lorene,
would just
please.
I would just add one thing. I tend to be rather dark and pessimistic when it comes to climate change topics. I have a hard time giving messages of hope. But one positive that's out there right now is that I'm pretty sure it's through the National Science Foundation, but it's definitely happening in Alaska, where Indigenous knowledge is being integrated into Western science studies. So it's no longer scientists coming in and say, hey, we're going to do this, and then they do it and leave, and the Native people are left going, well, so what, right? Well, now it's taken not only the step of coming back around and saying, hey, this is what we figured out, but hey, what do you know? And how can we take that knowledge and integrate it into the Western science, which is new? And it's something that's going to take some time, of course, because Western science is based on the scientific method, whereas Indigenous knowledge is based on lived experience and ancestral knowledge. And so it's a very different type of knowledge, but they're starting to figure out how to mix these two aspects. And I think that's just a huge positive, because there is a lot of knowledge with the Native peoples. They know the land, they know the history, they have experience. And so I think it's great that that is happening.
Yes, thank you so much for lifting that up. That, I mean, millennia of experience being on the land and living off it and stuff. And that's really good to hear. I look forward to learning more about how those are being integrated in the future. Thank you. Yeah, so we are moving on to the audience question portion. So what I'm going to try to do first is, if you have questions, if you want to first use the raise hand function, it should be down at the bottom left side of your screen if you have a question. Otherwise, we can try to do kind of first come, first serve in the chat, but it'd be great to hear other people's voices if anybody has questions. And we'll have about 20-ish minutes for questions. Yeah, I'm just going to start with
there.
Yeah,
There's
thank
a
you,
question
David.
there for Lorene in the chat.
Absolutely, yes. So I'm just going to start with Vuvu Antonio. Hi, everyone. I have a question for Laureen. Is there a way to prevent the methane from being released into the atmosphere? Is there a way to remove the methane from the lake before it actually melts?
So I'm not sure I'm 100% the best person to answer this question. I don't know if David or John, maybe you'd be better, but so a couple of things. One is that the leakage from gas infrastructure is probably a greater input of methane of greater concern, and something we can actually control better than environmental release. So getting, like, there was just a huge report put out about the leaks in Russia and in their gas infrastructure and their pipes. And then of course there's tons of leaks everywhere there's gas, because as anyone who's handled a propane tank knows, they're not 100% sealed. You smell the propane even if the tank is supposedly sealed. So getting our leaks under control is probably the first thing that we can actually do that will make the greatest impact. When it comes to the land releasing methane, so it happens on a huge broad scale. So there's no way to stop it other than reducing our greenhouse gas output in order to bring down global temperatures so that the release doesn't happen, which is a huge thing to try to figure out. There have been some attempts to figure out how to recover methane from lakes, and also there's, I can't remember the type of methane that's in the ocean, it's the ice methane. There have been some attempts to try to get some technology going to try to recover some of that, but it's difficult because there are, you know, Minnesota's the land of 10,000 lakes. There's millions of lakes in Alaska. And so to try to capture it from each one of the lakes is just logistically a very gigantic hurdle that I don't know if we'll be able to overcome. The ocean part, maybe some people could recover some of it, kind of like the methane recovery that's happening in landfills. And then I was just going to look back at the question, but the thing scrolled. And yeah, so I guess that answers the question too about removing methane from a lake before it actually melts. It's logistically very, very difficult. We'd be way better off controlling our greenhouse gas output and our temperatures to stop that from happening.
So one thing I'll just say as a follow-up to that, and I'd like to call on John Galbraith to address this. John is really a specialist in anthropogenic soils, And one of the soil types that we talk about a lot are landfill soils. So where we see methanogenesis coming from landfills, right, we know that there are actually methane wells that get installed there that can kind of serve as a sink, right, to suck that methane out of landfills. John, do you want to just comment on that briefly?
Yes, so these are the reclaimed landfills, and essentially they have geotextile liners in them that prevent the methane from escaping from the soil. So there's decomposition going on underneath the soil, and the microbes are breaking down some of the garbage and wood products. There's an amazing amount of wood that is dumped into landfills that's not actually manufactured by humans. It's just yard waste that goes in there. But the decomposition is going on, methane is being released. So what they started doing was they started requiring a capping material, something that was impervious to gas escape, and then they would collect the methane from underneath that material, and they would siphon it off and use it for purposes such as heating buildings and things like that. That's how it is done on a small scale. These landfills are no more than 5 acres in size. So to be able to translate that to a landscape scale in Alaska, it would just not be possible. It would be possible, though, to reclaim existing landfills and cap those, so you could minimize the escape from existing landfills. But I don't see it being able to be applied on larger scales than that.
There's a question here that came in about carbon capture technology. Maybe Nick, would you like to address that and just talk a little bit about the role of soil in carbon capture?
Yeah, I could do a little bit of that. I was actually just reading an article this morning about some commercial proprietary carbon capture operations in Western Europe. And, so if we're talking about, and again, this is all just from my understanding of reading media stuff, but, if we're talking about carbon capture as sort of an active process, I was just reading one plant that's up right now is removing the amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere that would come out of 800 cars in the United States in a day. So not a lot of impact for one thing. Now, maybe that's scalable, maybe there's new technologies, right? And then to allude with what David just talked about, there are opportunities to sequester carbon in soils, probably not soils in cold regions, permafrost affected regions, because those soils may be more likely to lose carbon as they warm, because there's a significant amount of carbon locked in the permafrost, as other folks have suggested. There may be opportunities to sequester carbon in soils, especially of working lands in temperate and maybe even subtropical regions. But that all depends on land management of a lot of different actors. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions to billions of people that make decisions on the land every day, which may or may not influence the amount of the carbon in the soil. Theoretically, it's definitely possible that carbon sequestration could be a piece of a carbon reduction strategy, but it's only going to be a piece. And so I would say that, folks who are reading out there, there's a lot of stuff out there about carbon sequestration in soils potentially being a silver bullet and being the solution. And I would argue that we should take that information with a lot of caution, because I think, while there's a potential to be part of the solution, it's definitely not going to be the solution. I think other folks have alluded to other direct ways involving our own consumption patterns that could make a larger impact.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And I wanted to briefly lift up something Laureen said about gas wells as well. Many of us in Michigan are familiar with PFAS and PFOS chemicals being released. There's new evidence that a lot of the hot spots, a big article in The Guardian came out recently, that these gas wells are also responsible for putting a ton of those PFAS chemicals into the ground and then in our drinking water. So yet another reason to get off fossil fuels. So we have a question from Brian and then a question from Jody. Brian asks, can I assume that as we use Alaska as a climate change barometer, the permafrost issue is happening throughout the Arctic Circle. So is this a problem mostly limited to Alaska, or is this a global phenomena and maybe even in the Arctic Circle as well? Yeah.
It's a global phenomenon. And one of the things that I'd like to point out, which I always appreciated about working with the faculty at UAF and the folks in Alaska, it's a very international cast of characters there, right? So we have Russian scientists there, people from Northern Europe, Canadians, and they move back and forth. They'll spend part of the time, working in Alaska. They'll go over to Russia and work for a while, different parts around the world. And so it's a collaborative group of scientists that come together, but they don't just stay in one country and work. They actually go and look at these processes in many different countries, and they are happening in many, many different areas.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that too, because there's areas like China that, for instance, the headwaters of the Yellow River up there, about 40% of the watershed at the headwater consists of soils with permafrost, and these permafrost soils help to buffer runoff in the Yellow River and provide late summer discharge. And they're starting to see a drop. I think it's been like 14 to 16% drop in the late summer discharge in the Yellow River. And it's because a lot of it is coming from those permafrost soils that are starting to disappear in the watersheds. And we're no longer seeing that buffering effect, that effect of that soil that's got ice in it that slowly melts as the summer progresses and releases water into the watershed and helps to buffer and maintain the flows in those larger rivers. And so, this is a phenomenon that's going on worldwide. It's not just an Alaska sort of thing. Alaska, Canada, Siberia. Siberia's experiencing some of the biggest impacts of that because of, they've had 25 million acres that's burned this summer, and it has a dramatic effect on the carbon balance in these systems. And so it's a worldwide issue, and it's not just the Arctic, it's the subarctic. It extends all the way down to 60 degrees and even further south than that. So
yeah, and can I ask a quick follow-up? Is there any research on that in the Antarctic as well?
Well, yes, there is, but the Antarctic is a very harsh environment. So carbon is just not it's just not a part of those soils very much. It's such a harsh environment. You have mostly microbial activity and low order moss and fungi that are the common plant species. So and that same phenomenon carries north. Once you start to get north into the deep Arctic, soils don't contain much carbon. The environment is too harsh, and there is very little carbon that's produced, very little plant material as you get further north. So you kind of transition from the low to mid Arctic into the northern Arctic, where the carbon production is extremely low because of the extremely harsh environment.
I'll just add something really quick too, just about the pan-Arctic situation, is that the scientific community who's studying in the Arctic is definitely an Arctic focused community. So it's the entire Arctic of the globe. So the upcoming regional conference on permafrost and permafrost engineering is bringing in people from all over the world. We do tend to have a global community, even though we talk specifically about Alaska, just because our experience tends to be dominant here. It is a global Arctic phenomenon.
Excellent. Thanks, Lorene. Tim, do you have a question?
Actually, it's as much a comment as a question. For those who are looking to become, excuse me, actively engaged in working on the climate crisis, I put in the chat a couple of organizations, the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition with the web address, and Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm involved with both of those organizations, I also put my personal email there if anyone wants to contact me with any questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. We got to solve this problem together, so that's helpful. Jody had a question. Jody.
Sure. Thank you. It's a comment and a question, but so I just had the privilege of getting to watch your film this week, and I watched it. I'm from Canada, and so I listen to the CBC News, and while the government of Canada hasn't necessarily set great targets or met great targets, there is some good reporting on some of the things that are going on, and so I watched this film. While also, learning about Iqaluit in Nunavut, having like petroleum in the water supply. And so when you talk about the infrastructure breakdown and acceleration, it's sort of like, we're at such a, there's the nomenclature, it's a climate change, climate crisis. I guess my question is really, and I'd love to connect it to, David had asked a question in the chat on, this environmental storytelling is so important. Do you envision any new projects with an environmental focus? But really, it's sort of like, when we're sitting here in our lives, and we don't live this, and we don't get to, go to like Shishmaref, and we don't get to meet the woman who says, I'd rather eat than have that oil, which was for me like the most profound quote or like comment in the movie that just like went, Burr. I guess, it's, cliche, not like what can we do, but I guess it's just sort of like, I guess that is the question. It's sort of, how can we amplify, help? What can we do?
I'll say real quick, I'll just say, because we have done a series, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is in the film. She is a big voice in the world of climate science and connecting those things. And I will quote Laureen here actually, and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, and say, vote. You have to vote for candidates who make this their primary. Like the thing that this film and working with Dr. Hayhoe, we have a series for anyone that's interested called Global Weirding. It's a PBS digital series. It takes small bites at climate science education and teaching people in very small bites all of the issues that affect climate change, from political to even religious to science, all those types of things. And the big thing is we are at this point where the only thing that can change, that can really make the biggest impact, right? Like, and don't get me wrong, it's important that we recycle. It's important that we don't eat meat. All of those types of things are important in this battle and in this countdown and in this ticking time bomb that is climate change. But really the only thing that's going to make the changes that we need at this moment are voting in politicians who will make this the #1 priority for humanity. Like it is that point to where it takes an entire policy shift. So that goes both ways, right? That can be encouraging in some ways to put our political strength behind certain candidates and movements, but it's also sort of scary in the sense that in a place like the United States where things are so gridlocked, it's like, how can we ever actually get to the place we need to make these changes? And I don't know the answer, but I know that optimism, hope, and voting and joining things like Citizen Climate Lobby, which actually are the people that funded Global Weirding, joining these groups, the groups that you're involved in, fighting locally to help candidates win locally, right? Like we can't just put our hope in the politicians that are running for president. We have to do it on the local level. Vote for city council people, vote for school board members. It is about putting people in positions of power to make decisions that will change the system. And that starts at your most local level and goes all the way up to who you vote for president.
And I'll follow on that, and it also kind of touches on Elisa's question about how to engage with her students. At the end of every class that I lecture, I would always tell my students at the end of the semester, they got a quality education coming to a university that many people around the world would die to have the access to, right? And because of that, it is not only a suggestion, It is their obligation to stand up and be heard. They must stand up in a room where chaos rules and anybody that can step to the microphone can say anything they want. I mean, we see some of that going on with COVID right now, right? Everyone says, well, I don't need to be vaccinated or whatever. You know, there's all these claims, this, that, and the other. The scientists know what's up, right? The science has shown about vaccination. It's the same situation with climate. The scientists know what's going on. And when people are educated about these issues, they have to stand up and be heard. They cannot remain silent in the room. That's the most important thing that they could do.
Thanks, David. And I've been thinking about that a lot too, of, you know, you hear in climate change discussions a lot about like, what's our technological solution? Well, we have a technological solution to COVID-19 and we're not done with it. So clearly technology is not the only piece of the puzzle. So we're getting close to time, and I'd like to close out with Elise's question, because it kind of talks about working with the next generation coming up. She says, I have both a comment and a question. First, I think this film is remarkable and important for its blending of climate science mitigation with climate justice. As an educator at WMU, that's our local university here in Kalamazoo, I am seeking further ideas for how to integrate these areas of focus in climate change more effectively in communication to students, and welcome any suggestions to help accomplish this. And this question is open to any of our guests today.
I could take a first stab at that, unless David, you want to. So I could speak through the lens of, I have a research and a teaching appointment. And I can just say that one thing that has been transformed in my mind as a researcher, and this sort of touches to what Laureen was talking about earlier. When I first entered the world of studying permafrost affected soils, it was being hired as a for the National Park Service, working on a soils inventory. That was for supposed to be for this long-term monitoring of vegetation change. And the idea was we go out, we do the soils once, because most of us as soil scientists are used to thinking of soils changing over a long time period. And so, you know, when I go look at a soil in southern Minnesota, it's going to be more or less the same way by the time that I die, right? What has completely transformed from my lens over the last 13 years of looking at permafrost soils is that I was introduced to this lens of, well, you're doing a baseline. There's no such thing as a baseline because it's a moving target, particularly in these cold region permafrost affected soils. My thinking now when I go to view these soils as a researcher is I view them like sand mandalas that Buddhist monks do, where, you know, they spend a lot of time placing every grain of sand, and they, at the end of it, they actually destroy it, right? And so that's a reminder of the impermanence of life and change. And I think as we view these permafrost affected soils through the lens of climate change, we are looking at a moving target. And what struck me in the last 5 or 6 years is realizing that I may be looking at these soils now, and they're not going to look the same by the time I'm, you know, at the end of my career, even 10 years from now. And part of that ties into connecting that with the experiences of people who live there. And so I think this gets back to what Laureen was talking about with integrating Native perspectives. I know on a couple of projects that I'm involved in, that's an extremely important part of it, is actually prior to doing any research, building relationships and integrating perspectives of folks that are at Alaska Native corporations or tribal resource councils that are managing these lands. What are they interested in? What do they know? And how does science help support that? So I think from the standpoint of myself as a researcher and a teacher, I try to integrate the local perspective every time in my communication with students. So what are people actually experiencing and seeing? Because I think, as has been alluded to, those changes are happening much more rapidly in Alaska and in the soils that we're studying, or whatever ecological processes we're studying in Alaska compared to the temperate United States. And so, for example, one really striking example of that, Mark may have talked about this, is in Western Alaska, a lot of the native villages are along 2 rivers, the Yukon and the Kuskokwim River. And those are essentially highways, and people rely on those being frozen for large parts of the year. And if they're not frozen, if they're in a state of sort of like not quite frozen, but also you can't take a boat on them, that has a huge impact on people's lives. And so stories like that, drawing stories like that out of the science, and more importantly, connecting those stories to the science and to the research, I think that's where our greatest impact can be in teaching this stuff, because then all of a sudden it's like, oh, yeah, I get it. Somebody can't get in their car and drive on a frozen river because they can't do it. You know, it's an ice flow or something like that. And then what does that mean for them? And so I think the more we do that, local to global, global to local, the more effective the communication is going to be.
Well said. Does anybody have anything else they'd want to add before we begin to close this out? No? All right. Well, I do want to.
I'll add
please.
one thing, Ian, just
Yes,
real
please.
quick.
Yeah.
The one thing I would add is that just as Nick was just talking about personal connections, I think that is the number one place, is that people tend, unless you're a scientist yourself, it's not really the science that drives people's decision making. It is an emotional response. There's got to be some kind of connection. And so whether it's an interpersonal connection where they like you and so they want to listen to you, or you've tugged on some kind of deep personal emotional heartstring, that's the place when you're communicating to individuals that is probably more important than any facts you could ever talk about.
Yeah, I think, and Lorene, I agree with that. And also, I think the big issue we have, one issue we have too, is that we like to argue or talk about whether things are actually happening or not, whether the science supports it, instead of talking about things that are changing and what those things are and their common interests, and how we can kind of come together on a common interest. You know, whether it may be as simple as, do I want to, go skiing in the wintertime, at the local ski area? I might be a scientist for good skiing in the future, and it has to be something, a commonality, something that we want to have in the future, and things that we're willing to sacrifice for now to have in the future, and find that common ground and proceed based on that, not whether or not it's, climate change is happening or not. We're so far beyond that. But what do we do? How do we mitigate it? What do we do for our common good for the future, so we can enjoy doing the certain things that we have done, or whether we're subsisting in an Alaska environment? What can we do to have the major components of our subsistence lifestyle preserved, and take it from that perspective? And I think that's big. I think it is.
Very well said, Mark. And I think that kind of leads back to what Lorene was saying about integrating Indigenous science into the West. I think one thing we've forgotten in the West is kind of how to live within our means and live within natural boundaries. Fossil fuel kind of gave us a temporary jolt, and we're now paying the price for it. But I wanted to give an opportunity to David, Paul, and John, all of you, to have any closing comments. I'm going to skip the poll at the end, but the last thing I want to say before that is I will be providing a follow-up email to everybody that participated with all the wonderful links and resources shared in the chat, including Paul's comments as well. So maybe John, if you'd like to lead us off.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, in the process of making the film and then watching the film, I really learned a tremendous amount. So I'm very grateful for being included on it, but also just as a viewer of the film, it helped me to put some things into perspective and to put myself in the place of the people who are being interviewed. I know I haven't done that, and I haven't lived their lifestyle, but I feel like I'm more aware now of some of the issues that they're facing that are being driven by a changing climate. And so I'm grateful for that. My experience of being in Alaska and working there, leading the the soils trip. I've actually led the last two soils trips up there, and the response among students is tremendous. We had 64 students that applied for 15 positions on the trip last year, and I don't doubt that we'll even have even more. And I'm very grateful for Mark Clark for coming along on the trip, and Laureen for educating us about reclamation efforts as well. But my overall, takeaway from Alaska is just how unspoiled it really is in very, very large parts, and how unfortunately the things that humans are doing in other parts of the planet are going to spoil it and change it in a devastating way for the native people and all people that live there. And I wish there was something we could do about it. And I hope that through discussions like this and the groups that sponsored this talk and that are doing good things about climate and discussing it, that hopefully the world will become educated to the problem and then do something about it in the future.
I'll be super quick. I just want to say thank you to everyone tonight. It's been so amazing to share this film with so many people across the world. David even went to Morocco to share this film, and the response has been so heartwarming and amazing. And I hope that you feel energized that we can do something and that we can make change happen, and that education, storytelling, narrative is important in how we make change as it concerns the climate.
I'll simply follow and say that making this film has been a life-changing experience for me. Working with all of these professionals here that are on the call tonight and featured in the film has just been amazing. And I'll never forget that experience to the last of my days. The students that I've engaged with up there, it has also had a profound impact on them. I'll never forget introducing one of my graduate students at her doctoral defense. And I said, if you want a sense of what an education at the graduate level has been like as this team, I've worked with the student on the tundra of Alaska, and I've stood in the Sistine Chapel with her. We've published papers together, we've been around the world, and that kind of, engagement with those students, that's some of what these comments are talking about here. How do you get students off the sidelines and engaged? And they can make a difference. They are going to be the next generation, right? That are going to be in our classrooms, inspiring people to affect change. So I just feel honored to have been a part of that, and compliment everyone else here on the team as well who served to inspire those students.
Thank you, David. Laureen, Nick, or Mark, anything you want to add before we close out?
I don't think I have anything to add, but other than in the face of kind of desperation, I think it's also important that just to remember that really the only person you can control is you. And so your own personal decisions are the ones that you have to live with. And so knowing that and just starting there is a really good place, making choices that benefit the climate. And then anything you can do above and beyond that is just an added benefit.
Absolutely. Well, then I can say officially, thank you so much, David, Laureen, Nick, Paul, John, and Mark for joining us and offering your time. This was an awesome discussion. I'm really glad we got to do it. And I wanted to say quickly too, I love talking about the next generation. I mean, I'm young, I'm only 30, but I gotta say, the rest of us aren't off the hook either. We got to do our own part. And as everybody said, we got to vote, we got to act. So again, thank you everybody for participating. This was excellent. I will follow up with lots of links and great information that was shared in the chat in an email. And so, yeah, this concludes the event. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Take care.